Hello, this is the 27th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Our first reading is from the book of Isaiah, chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. Our psalm is Psalm 80. Our second reading is Philippians, chapter 4, verses 6 through 9. And our gospel is from the book of Matthew, chapter 21, verses 33 to 43. Our readings today talk a lot about vineyards and the fruit that they produce. And if we consider that the prophet Isaiah is describing God's people as a vineyard, and that Jesus is describing God's kingdom as a vineyard, we can realize that all along we, the people, have been here on earth tasked with working this vineyard, this carefully constructed vineyard, producing God's fruit. And it seems that the vineyard has not always been kept up. It hasn't always produced good fruit. It hasn't always stayed in good repair. And why is this? Isaiah describes God as his friend, my friend's vineyard, he says. And why do we want to mess up our friend's vineyard? I don't think that we're doing it on purpose. We don't want to go against God's plan for the vineyard, but we do have our own ideas of what the plan should be sometimes. And we do, sometimes, think that we know how the vineyard ought to be tended. And we think, sometimes, that we know what's best. And I think it's at these times when we're falling into error, when we make mistakes in the vineyard, I think it's good that God is our friend, that he's patient and kind and merciful and loves us. Because if history shows us anything, it shows thousands of years of God telling us how to tend the vineyard, and it shows thousands of years of us messing it up. All the stories of the Old Testament, the plight of God's people through history, demonstrate the ways God has taught us how to tend his vineyard. And it's the story of repeated failures, of coming up short, of not producing good fruit. And God will send a prophet, and the prophet will come and he'll tell the people what they're doing wrong, what they're missing. And the people will do better for a while. But then we always drift back into tending the vineyard how we want to. And there's a lot of legalism in the Old Testament. This sin equals this punishment. This has to be done this way. That has to be done that way. Very orderly procedures. And it's supposed to help us tend the vineyard the right way. The right way so that we can produce good fruit. That's what it's all about. That's what Jesus is alluding to in his parable. The servants that Jesus is talking about are the prophets, the messengers. And they're sent to talk about the fruit in the vineyard. And what is this fruit? Love. Love is the fruit. All the things that the people were supposed to be doing, all the ways that they're supposed to be using the vineyard, the fruit is always supposed to be love. Jesus said in Matthew 22, verse 37 through 40, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these two commandments. You see, Jesus is saying that everything that the people have ever been supposed to do is based on love. Love of God and love of neighbor. All the Old Testament laws and rules and regulations, even our own rules and regulations in the Catechism, should be to help us love God and love our neighbor. And being legalistically minded, people have always gotten bogged down in the minutiae of following the rules and regs. We want every detail spelled out so that we can have the letter of the law and know exactly what it is we're supposed to do. I guess that's because the spirit of the law seems beyond us sometimes. Love of God, love of neighbor. That's what we're supposed to be doing in this vineyard. It's what we're always supposed to be doing. And as Jesus says in the parable, the landowner, God, periodically sends servants to ask about the fruit in the vineyard. And in the Old Testament, the prophet's message is always the same. The prophet always shows up and says, you know what, y'all ain't doing it right. They're either always missing one or the other or both of these two commandments. They're either not loving God alone or they're not loving their neighbors. And the people hear it. And it always seems that they then kill the prophet, or try to. They always try to kill the prophet. But God keeps sending them. And he still sends his servants to tell us when we aren't loving him or we aren't loving our neighbor. when we're messing up the vineyard? And of course, we don't stone them in the streets anymore like they did to the prophets of old, but we do try to destroy them in other ways. We're sophisticated now, so we use our words. We'll say things like, oh, well, he's gay, so him telling me that I need to be more open and loving to others and accepting of people on the fringes, there must be some other agenda. Because he's gay, can't possibly just be saying to love your neighbor. Or what about her? She's not even ordained, and, she's just so preachy, and her message to love your neighbor must be invalid. She must have some other kind of agenda. Besides love your neighbor, of course. And what about him over there? He just wants to be in the spotlight. He's just trying to make a name for himself nationally so that he can go on to bigger and better things. The message can't just be love. He must have another agenda. What about that group? They just want to jump on the bandwagon of every new cause, every new fad, telling us to love these people, care for those people, stand with this group, whatever cause is in the news. They want to hang a banner up, always telling us to love somebody else. Can't just be love your neighbor. There must be some other agenda at foot. As humans, we have a knack for finding what's wrong with the messenger, of finding why the message can't be valid because we don't agree with the messenger. We always think that the messenger must be up to something. God wouldn't send anybody down here to tell us what's wrong with this vineyard, would he? There's one thing that you can be sure of. It's that we humans always mess the vineyard up. We always mess it up the same way, and God always sends messengers to tell us the same thing. Love of God, love of neighbor. That's it. And if there's one thing that you can be sure of, God can use any faulty human to deliver his message, which is good because he only has faulty humans to work with. God's message of love can come from anywhere that he wants it to. So when God sends his messengers to us, the keepers of the vineyard, when he sends the messengers telling us that we aren't doing it right, that we aren't tending the vineyard the way we're supposed to, that we aren't loving him or we aren't loving others, do we receive his message? Or are we caught up in running the vineyard the way that we run it, the right way, following all the rules and regs, the way it's always been? Do we stone those messengers when they show up? And when Jesus comes among us as the sick and the hungry and the needy, do we see him? Do we recognize our friend? Do we love him in others? Or do we lose sight of what kind of fruit this vineyard is supposed to be producing?